This is something you can't ignore. This is the biggest opportunity that will ever exist in the crypto category.
Something is happening with Bitcoin that most people don't know about.
I think Bitcoin, above 150, 200K by end of year is entirely, I think, a conservative estimate.
Bitcoin DeFi and a new Bitcoin token economy is booming on top of Bitcoin and growing fast. Today I bring on an expert to tell us all about the top Bitcoin DeFi projects because this is the biggest opportunity in crypto in over a decade.
I've been in this space for 14 years now, and there's very few moments where I'm like, this is one of the biggest bets I could make in my career. One of them was Bitcoin itself. This is the other one, which is DeFi on top of Bitcoin.
Get ready to get excited about Bitcoin DeFi.
It's kind of common sense when you think about it. Bitcoin is larger than everything else combined. Not just larger than Ethereum, it's larger than Ethereum plus Solana plus everything. So if some people are skeptical, like, oh, well, can you actually do DeFi on Bitcoin? Or, yeah, but it's a little clunky to do. Do you really want to fade one of the biggest opportunities or biggest capital unlocks ever to occur in crypto?
I truly became bullish on Bitcoin DeFi after chatting with Dan in this video. Smash the like button, send this to one friend who needs to know about Bitcoin DeFi. Let's get started. Let me intro this. Dan Held is an early Bitcoiner. He is a Bitcoin OG. Now, his resume, previous head of growth at Uber, marketing at Kraken, product at blockchain.com. Now he is a general partner at Asymmetric, making him an avid investor in Bitcoin DeFi. Dan truly has his ear to the ground and finger on the pulse when it comes to what comes next for Bitcoin. So many people own Bitcoin, like Bitcoin, are realizing the value prop of Bitcoin now more than ever. But I don't know. I don't think people truly realize Bitcoin DeFi is happening and it's this nascent thing exploding with growth. Dan, I've been following you for a while. Thank you for coming back on the show. How's it going?
Aaron, thanks for having me. I think, I've been coming on the podcast for almost 6 years now, I think, which is wild. I mean, Bitcoin was probably sub $10,000 when we first went on. So pretty crazy to be where we're at today, where Bitcoin's, above 100K, we're hitting all-time highs. This is a pretty momentous situation. And also one that I feel like it almost feels surreal in a way that we're actually here. I was always a believer from very early 2011, 2012 is when I first got in. But to see top institutions like we had Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan talk positively about Bitcoin, which I actually tweeted out. I'm like, what parallel universe am I living in? This is interesting because we were always the rebels, the bad guys, and now the top institutions in the world are siding with us.
Totally. It's a magical time in the Bitcoin space. And before we get into Bitcoin DeFi, let's just talk about Bitcoin generally. Bitcoin's price exploding, making new highs, still very volatile, of course. But like in your assessment of this cycle, like what is going on?
Yeah, so in this cycle, I would say while we're breaking all-time highs, I don't think we're anywhere near the top. You've got a couple different indicators here that I personally use. Look, this is not like ultra scientific. It's just this is my fourth cycle. So I would say like I know a thing or two about it, but again, I can't predict exactly where Bitcoin's price is going to go when. But there's a few things that haven't changed. Humans haven't changed in how they perceive Bitcoin and the boom bust cycles of Bitcoin are reflecting upon human emotion, fear and greed, right? And so I don't see very many greedy signals right now. I don't see uh, Coinbase hitting the top free app ranking in the App Store. Google searches for buy Bitcoin. If you look at Google search trends, and anyone can go look this up, those haven't even gotten close to peak. In fact, it's quite quiet. You're not getting blown up by family and friends going, hey, should I buy? I've got none of that going on right now in terms of those are kind of my classic indicators for a frothy market. This is a really solid, I think, great foundation for a bull run where we hit these all-time highs, a while back, and now we're going. But we kind of bottomed out, and whoever wanted to sell sold. Now Bitcoin's rebounded back up to all-time highs, where this sets up a really good foundation where I'm not sure who the incremental seller is going to be right now above this price. If anyone wanted to sell, they had 6 months to sell. And so I think that plus increase in demand. So you've got a reduction in supply, increase in demand. You've got tariffs and other things looking like they're going to be resolved. I think this is a very good setup for Bitcoin to have an incredible run this year. Yeah, $100,000. A lot of people are like, oh, maybe that's the high of the cycle. I'm like, you got to be shitting me. Of course it's not. Bitcoin's not just going to go from, last all-time high being 60K, 4 years ago up to 100K and that's it. But Bitcoin doesn't work that way. It's a 21 million fixed supply and incremental increases in demand have huge impact on price. That's why it's so volatile. So yeah, I think Bitcoin, above 150, 200K by end of year is entirely, I think, a conservative estimate. So yeah, I think like right now we're in an incredible setup.
Very interesting. I want to talk about, demand catalysts in just a second, but you named the price prediction. You said 250K by the end of this year is conservative. Dan, is that really conservative?
I said 150 to 200K, but yeah, 250K, I think, look, I mean, at 150K, you're only talking about 2x times previous all-time highs, like a little above 2x. Like, sure, that could be the case, but I don't think so. I mean, the amount of bullishness in this space in terms of like, if you got the president hard shilling Bitcoin, once this price gets going, I just don't see how it's going to stop.
I mean, and definitely I think I've drank the Kool-Aid, obviously. I'm a believer, but I think 150 Bitcoin this year is programmed. And just talking about the demand narrative catalysts that we're seeing this cycle over previous cycles, I'm going to name four things, and you tell me kind of which one you think has the biggest impact. There's BlackRock and Wall Street getting in. There's the US becoming crypto friendly. There's now multiple companies announcing Bitcoin treasury strategies. And now we're seeing Middle East sovereign wealth funds investing. What do you think has the biggest impact?
I mean, sovereign level purchases, I think, are the biggest impact. One is that they've got the biggest balance sheets in the world, and if they start allocating into Bitcoin, that kicks off, I would call it kind of the final game theoretic arms race, where if Bitcoin truly fulfills its purpose of being digital gold, that means it's used as a world reserve asset. And if countries start to use Bitcoin to back their currency or to bolster confidence in their currency, Bitcoin has then achieved a government level legitimacy as a gold equivalent, which is huge. But again, they're purchasing, these governments have $1 trillion balance sheets. We're talking about an incremental amount of purchasing power that far strips out or far outpaces what corporates could go allocate. Like, yeah, cool. MicroStrategy has bought, I forget how much now, but I don't know, 30, 50 billion, something like that. I mean, that's just like a drop in the bucket for the United States government, right? So if they start to allocate, and then game theoretically, Russia, China, Japan, Germany, they all think about, well, if the US is allocating, should we allocate? That kicks off a game theoretic environment that where, that very much plows the way for an eventual $1 million Bitcoin price. Um, so yeah, government sovereigns are, I think, the number one most important catalyst now. I think the regulatory environment in the US is huge. A lot of other governments basically frame their regulatory environment for Bitcoin and crypto based on the US government. So seeing the US become really pro crypto is incredible. But yeah, the corporate side, I don't think we should downplay that. But on my stack ranking, sovereigns at the top. But on the corporate side, I mean, all of these different companies acquiring Bitcoin, putting it on their balance sheet, that's great. I will add a caveat where, I look, big fan of Michael Saylor, big fan of MicroStrategy. There's not a lot of ways it can blow up. MicroStrategy is a bit more sound in their approach for Bitcoin accumulation. These other entities are the way that they're playing it is a little more fast and loose. And I think on the backside of this cycle, we could see a lot of these entities kind of blow up. And a lot of retail folks are buying, this at a multiple of NAV, a net asset value is the basic underlying book value of the Bitcoin held on the balance sheet. I'm not sure if there's a case to be made for a multiplier on NAV, especially where, like, for example, in a more bearish cycle where this is on the other side of this bull run, I could see some of these entities kind of blowing up. So like it. I like what I'm seeing there. I'd like to see it done in a long-term, safe manner, which I think MicroStrategy is doing it that way. Some of these other corporates, I think, are doing it a little bit haphazardly.
Interesting. You keep things real. That's why we like having you on. And you're an expert in Bitcoin DeFi. And like I said, so let's jump into Bitcoin DeFi. And like I said, I think most people who hold Bitcoin, like Bitcoin, are believers in Bitcoin, don't really realize what's going on with Bitcoin DeFi. So please put it in context for us, catch us up. What is Bitcoin DeFi?
So Bitcoin DeFi would be doing DeFi activities, lending, borrowing, staking, buying and selling other assets on the Bitcoin blockchain. So what's funny is that Bitcoin DeFi, DeFi actually originated on Bitcoin. For example, ordinals and NFTs actually started on something called Counterparty back in 2015. So Bitcoin actually pioneered a lot of these DeFi technologies, except the Bitcoin network itself is quite primitive. And then there was other L1s that really took that baton and ran with it, made it what it is today. Ethereum and Solana being prime examples of truly turning DeFi into something real. But Bitcoin had little glimmers of DeFi back in the day. Counterparty, which was you could call it a meta protocol on Bitcoin, kind of like an early ordinals-esque sort of protocol. They pioneered NFTs. Rare Pepes were the first NFTs. Then you had things like Join Market, which you could provide liquidity for people wanting to mix their coins. That was one of the first yielding solutions, DeFi yielding solutions, and that originated on Bitcoin. So Bitcoin's DeFi architecture now is quite primitive and underinvested in. DeFi, as we saw in Ethereum and Solana, flourished. A lot of people want to do these things. And I think that we should bring this activity back to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the biggest market cap asset, not just biggest, but bigger than everything else combined. So Bitcoin is the number one asset in the space. It's got the most liquidity. It's got the most number of users. If you were to go build a dApp, it makes sense to build it over on Bitcoin. Now, they weren't able to do that in prior cycles because L2s hadn't been built out to such a degree that would be supportive of DeFi activity happening on Bitcoin. I think Liquid is a prime example of a really failed L2. Liquid was a cool idea, sidechain built by Blockstream, but they just didn't put any marketing behind it. They didn't do any ecosystem development, which, as we've seen with Ethereum L2s, was critical for their success. And I've spent quite a bit of time looking at the Ethereum L2 landscape, how that blossomed, and how that might go blossom over on Bitcoin. So Bitcoin DeFi, I would say like broad categorically, like in terms of like what's inside of it. You've got L2s, meta protocols, which would be ordinals, dApps, and staking protocols like Babylon. So underneath that, those are different, I would say kind of the broad buckets of what my fund, asymmetric, what we focus on.
And, as a Bitcoin holder, obviously, I think most people want Bitcoin to become more ubiquitous in the world and for Bitcoin to grow and ultimately for the price to go up. So, obviously, when the DeFi ecosystem came to Ethereum and Solana, it seemed like that was really good for the underlying assets. Should we be thinking about the same with Bitcoin? Like, why is it important and significant that this Bitcoin DeFi ecosystem needs to develop? Like, why should we be excited about this?
Yeah, that's a great question where like I would say DeFi is critical to Ethereum and Solana's price appreciation and value accrual. Where on Bitcoin, I think it's more of unlocking Bitcoin's next era rather than I think Bitcoin's monetary policy, it's 21 million hard cap, Bitcoin being used as a pristine piece of collateral. That's a huge amount of its value prop. And so what I see a DeFi being is it's basically unlocking Bitcoin's max utility rather than Bitcoin has to have DeFi in order to fulfill its mission. And if you look at the premise of Bitcoin, why Satoshi started Bitcoin, et cetera, like a lot of it is this permissionless, decentralized finance system. So I think it's very much in the ethos of Bitcoin and what we started here for Bitcoin to kind of step in and have this DeFi activity occur. But most importantly, what I discovered is that, in my 4 cycles in this space, I wish that people would go read Austrian economics textbooks. I wish they would understand what money is. I wish they would understand how Bitcoin works, but that's not how adoption works. How adoption works is people come in because of speculation and then they stay for the sound money. So most people come in because their buddy's buying it, they see the price go up. It's just human nature. They can't help it. Now, last cycle is heavy content focused on converting the speculators into sound money understanders. And I think I did a good job of that. But what I realized too is that on Ethereum and Solana, they had more speculative games that brought in more speculators. And those speculators led to greater adoption in Solana and Ethereum. And what if we could steal some of that market share back and bring it into Bitcoin? I think DeFi does that. A good analogy I have is imagine the Bitcoin casino using your Bitcoin chip, Bitcoin token. Imagine it's the biggest casino and it's got the most people in it, but there's only one type of game. It's a slot machine, spot trading, up and down, just buy or sell. Well, on Solana and Ethereum, with your Solana and Ethereum chip, you could go into the casino and do yield farming, staking, lending, borrowing. You could buy other tokens for other games. And that speculative mechanic led to a lot of adoption. And I noticed this in particular, for example, at NFT NYC. 2022, I was there and I was talking to a more creative individual. And they were like, yeah, so I bought this NFT for zero point 0.1 ETH and I flipped it for zero point 0.3. And I had kind of an aha moment where I'm like, they are entering the Ethereum casino with Ethereum chips. Now they're thinking about money in an Ethereum denomination. And so eventually they're going to leave that casino and probably have some Ethereum chips left in their pocket, just like the Bitcoin speculators who are just doing spot trading. They came into the Bitcoin casino buying and selling and left with a little bit of Bitcoin in their pocket. Now they're thinking in a Bitcoin. Now they're thinking in an Ethereum standard. And so that's where it really clicked for me that for Bitcoin to have as much dominance as it can in the crypto category and for its long-term max adoption, having all of these financial primitives or what I might call speculative games are what lead to long-term adoption. I actually explore this topic extensively where I had something drafted but never published it, where it looked into the early adoption of equities and options and other asset types. And most new asset types are viewed with like the speculative uh, derogatory sort of slant that this is a speculative activity. Um, but as we've seen with Bitcoin through 4 cycles now, this is how adoption occurs. So DeFi, TLDR, DeFi allows for max speculative activities. It also unlocks the more power to owning Bitcoin, where, for example, you could borrow permissionlessly dollars using your Bitcoin as collateral. I think that those use cases kind of fulfill Bitcoin's ultimate vision. Whereas I think Bitcoin network doesn't rely on like it doesn't, DeFi doesn't have to thrive for Bitcoin to succeed. It unlocks, I think, the next level of value in Bitcoin.
Now, you're in a GP at Asymmetric, and so I'd love it if you could tell us some of the top projects in Bitcoin today. Now, obviously, you're invested in some, so you're biased, but obviously, you're just investing the ones you think are really good. But
Yeah.
don't have to limit yourself to ones you're invested in. Just generally, what are the top projects like rising to the top in the Bitcoin DeFi space today? And let us know if there's like a token or not.
Yeah. So most of these projects have a token. Just gonna throw that out there because I think with protocols, I'm not sure how else you would accrue value.
Hmm.
It's pretty tough for the protocol to accrue value. And what we noticed for growth, given my background in growth marketing and growth product, for growth, having that token basically means like you can give away equity. And that's a huge incentive lever you could use to gain users and adoption. And we saw that work quite well over on Ethereum and Solana. And so a lot of these Bitcoin projects are replicating that. So I think there's a lot of insights from last cycle to where a token is hugely valuable. And it's really hard to say like how else would an L2 accrue value, right? Um, top projects in the space, I'll name one that I'm not invested in so we can start out there so I don't come across too biased.
And by
But
the way, I want you to be biased and like obviously you invested in them because they're good projects. So
yeah.
don't feel any shame saying what you're invested into.
Of course, and we invest in things because I have a super strong conviction in the founders, and for us, yeah, I do like to caveat what we are or not invested in. But Babylon, for example, I would say has the greatest mind share. Babylon's kind of like an eigenlayer equivalent for Bitcoin. At Asymmetric, we did not invest just because the valuations were too high. We're an earlier stage fund, but we're huge fans of David Say and team. So I think that one is like they've already had their TGE, they're out there. A lot of folks I think would find that interesting. I would say L2s, we've got Bob, Mezzo, BitLayer. Those are some of the top L2s in the space that we've invested in. We look for, and by the way, the thematic across all of our founders thematically, what we look for is, does this founder have grit? Are they going to go build an ecosystem, entice app developers to come build on them? Are they going to raise enough capital to attract and get users for their L2? So we look for founders who are relentless. I would say that's like the one key word that I would use to describe everyone that we invest in. And I'm pretty proud of the L2 portfolio we assembled there. We've also invested in Arch and other types of meta protocols. So like Arch and Fractal. So meta protocols are kind of like a layer 1.5. They're not the base layer and they're not an L2. So with meta protocols, those are really unique opportunities. Matt over at Arch, really brilliant. Love him. Fractal. You've got Unisat, which is the team behind Fractal. Lorenzo is incredibly sharp, and they've were kind of early to execute. Then you have, I think, really fun more dApps. For example, SatFlow and Liquidium. Liquidium is one of the most popular dApps in the Ordinals ecosystem. It allows you to borrow Bitcoin using your Ordinal as collateral. So I think that was one of the first mega use cases in the Ordinal category, and they're one of the most popular dApps that exist. We love Robin and the team. They've been working at this for almost 3 years now. So that's kind of a small sampling of our portfolio. I know we're missing out a few, for example, SatLayer. Sat layer works kind of as another layer on top of Babylon. So, there's quite a few different sectors we invest in. We're also looking, and we're constantly looking for new things. Like, for example, we like, we were not, we're basically L2 agnostic. Like, we like Lightning. We're fans of, we know the team quite well. We are looking at builders who are building on Lightning. I think a lot of Lightning activity was focused on payments, and we're not bullish on that use case. It's very clear no one wants to spend their Bitcoin, Ethereum, or whatever on coffee. Almost no one wants to do that. So Lightning used for that, we are 0% bullish on. Lightning being used to facilitate trading or other DeFi-esque activities, we're hugely bullish on that. Like LNFi or LN Markets, like those are two really cool folks building over there. So yeah, we explore a lot of different ecosystems, but primarily focused on infrastructure, L2s, meta protocols, and a few dApps.
Awesome. And, as we're finishing up the discussion on Bitcoin DeFi, is there one thing that you wish more people understood about Bitcoin DeFi generally, or just, leave us with something with Bitcoin DeFi specifically?
Well, I'll give you guys the kind of the TLDR hard shell I give that I gave all my LPs, and basically kind of how I feel about the category. I've been in this space for 14 years now. And there's very few moments where I'm like, this is one of the biggest bets I can make in my career. One of them was Bitcoin itself. And this is the other one, which is DeFi on top of Bitcoin. It's kind of, common sense when you think about it. Bitcoin is larger than everything else combined. It's not just larger than Ethereum, it's larger than Ethereum plus Solana plus everything. So if, some people are skeptical, like, oh, well, can you actually do DeFi on Bitcoin? Or, yeah, but it's a little clunky to do. Do you really want to fade one of the biggest opportunities or biggest capital unlocks ever to occur in crypto? I mean, if we unlock a little bit of Bitcoin lock and take that and put it into, that TVL gets put into different Bitcoin DeFi projects, just a tiny fraction of that would be greater than all the TVL locked up across all the other smart contract platforms. So for me, it's, do you want to fade one of the largest opportunities ever to exist? I could be wrong with my thesis. I don't think I am, but that's what I leave people with is this is something you can't ignore. This is the biggest opportunity that will ever exist in the crypto category.
Amazing. Guys, people in the Altcoin Daily audience, go follow Dan. I'm going to leave his stuff below. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the pod today.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate you having me. Cheers.
Cheers.